Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the 286 Project. And in this podcast, we talk about arts, culture, politics, sport, and anything else we can think of. Today's guest is a renowned sports writer. He's a three-time winner of the William Hill Sports Book of the Year award. His latest book, Answered Prayers, England and the 1966 World Cup, was longlisted for this year's award. His name is Duncan Hamilton, and he's here to talk to me about this book today. Duncan.
Hi, Chris.
Oh, yeah. So I imagine some sports fans might know your work or read your work, but for those who haven't, I said you're a sports writer. Can you just explain your journey to be a sports writer and also the books you've written as well?
Yeah, I started off because I always wanted to go into journalism, basically on the basis that I didn't think I was fit to actually do anything else. I mean, I had no other qualifications. I think I was only interested in a handful of things when I was in school. History, English, sport and kind of art. So it made sense really to kind of write about the history of sport. But I covered football for probably far too long actually. I covered Nottingham Forest at the time when they were very successful and when Brian Clough was manager. And so the first book I wrote was called Provided You Don't Kiss Me, and that came out in 2007. And I've not stopped since really. I tend to alternate between writing a book about football and then a book about cricket. But in the meantime, I've also written a biography of a 19th century jewel thief and a biography of Eric Liddell, the Chariots of Fire runner. And other books include George Best, for which the film rights have just been bought, and in cricket, Harold Larwood, for which the film rights have also just been bought. So it's been a pretty odd kind of year, really, but a pleasant one.
Okay, good. So I mentioned your book that was longlisted for the William Hill Sports Book of the Year award, Answered Prayers, England and the 1966 World Cup. Bearing in mind, there's been a lot of interviews with former players who played in that final, and there's been a lot of documentaries already about that subject. What compelled you to write about this particular actual tournaments, and specifically about England during that time?
Well, I know. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, I've got most of those books, and I think I've got most of the magazines, and I've seen most of the DVDs. And I think by about 10 years ago, I was quite fed up of seeing them, and I had no intention whatsoever of writing a book about 1966. I didn't think that anything else could possibly be said about it. And I thought to myself, during the first lockdown, when we'd been starved of sport for so long, or starved of live sport, Channel 4 decided to show the 1966 World Cup final. And they were essentially raising money for people who were either had relatives who had suffered from COVID, or they were suffering from COVID themselves. And I said to my wife, Mandy, I said, I don't really want to watch this. I said, I don't think there's anything else I want to say about the 1966 World Cup. And I'm not sure that there's anything else to say about the 1966 World Cup. And I probably watched the game. I mean, I remember watching the game when I was nearly 8, and with my father and my grandfather. And I watched the game for research purposes probably a couple of times after that. But of course, I'd seen all the TV programs and the little edited highlights. But for this, and I don't know why. I mean, perhaps it was because it was kind of locked down. You had a sort of profound and accentuated sense of your own mortality. You had the fact that there hadn't been any live sport, and I would have probably come to watch you play football if you'd been in the back garden. There's kind of I kind of happened to switch over, and they were already about 10 minutes into the game, and I knew that England were about to concede a kind of goal, but for some reason I couldn't stop watching it. And it was if I'd never seen the game before, because I noticed things in it that I hadn't really appreciated before. And again, I suppose it's really with the passage of time. I mean, it's such a the kind of game as it was in the 1960s is so different from the modern game. Not only in the kind of speed at which it's played, but just the way that it's played. Yeah. And I just kept on picking things up. And then at the end, when it was when they were going up to win the trophy, and Kenneth Wolstenholme is saying this is probably the greatest ever English sporting achievement in the whole history of the nation's sport, I started to look at all the players who were kind of going up for their medals, and I thought, yes, Bobby Moore, he died at 53. Alan Ball died shortly at 60. This player has dementia. That player has dementia. And it suddenly occurred to me that not only was it a great triumph, but actually nothing much happened after it. England could never regain, they got knocked out. They could never regain the kind of status that they had on that day. And they didn't really come that close, apart obviously from being knocked out of the quarterfinals in 1970. And there's a Ford Madox Ford book called The Good Soldier, and it starts with a line, I think, which is, "This is the saddest story I have ever heard." And that was just reverberating around my head. And I suddenly thought, goodness, I'm going to have to write about this.
So we'll start off with the manager, Alf Ramsey, who, when I was reading the book, seems to be someone who doesn't really show, would it be fair to say, he doesn't show a lot of emotion or whatnot? Very smart man, but doesn't necessarily show a lot of outward emotion. Would that be fair to say?
Absolutely. Very much a kind of reserved, buttoned up character. I mean, he didn't like, for example, having to deal with the media, which he, and he used to try to keep them at arm's length. I mean, he used to say that to reporters, "Why do you always keep on ringing me?" "Well, it's because you actually want something." "Well, why do I never ring you?" "Because I don't want anything from you."
Yeah.
And I mean, that was the kind of figure that he was. And there's a fabulous line I heard about somebody ringing with home on a Sunday, and he picked the phone up, and in a kind of self-contained kind of fury said, "I am now going to put the phone down very slowly." And someone, I mean, if someone said to him, "Can I have a quick word, Alf?" he would say, "Yes, good day, bye." But I don't think that is the word that you want to hear. And there was an overseas journalist who said, "Do you remember me, Alf?" And he said, "Yes." And there was a kind of expletive, and he said, "You're just a pest." And he just walks off. And so, that's the way that he was. And it was partly because of his upbringing. He came from a very poor upbringing. And as you probably know, and if you've seen any kind of TV film of him when he's been given an interview, he did have a little battle with the English language at times, because he tried, in a bit like Pig the Melian, really. I mean, he did try to find his own sort of Henry Higgins, which was actually the home service on their BBC radio, and kind of try to kind of cultivate a more middle class accent to hide the fact that he was essentially a working class person. Because obviously accent in the 1950s was kind of far more important than it is now.
Yeah. So he starts off playing for Tottenham Hotspur, does well there, and then when their manager left, he expected to get the manager's role. Is that correct? But didn't. So why didn't he get the manager's role, and what was his feelings about not getting the manager's role?
Well, he was hoping to. He was hoping to become essentially the assistant manager, which would have been the coach. But he didn't get on terribly well with some of the other players in the dressing room, who thought he was a bit authoritarian, and he just couldn't cultivate. And then it goes back to his personality again, that he couldn't cultivate at that particular time a kind of rapport or a kind of close enough rapport with the people that he was actually dealing with and actually playing alongside. And he had learned so much from the Tottenham manager, Arthur Rowe. I mean, I was amazed when I looked at what Arthur Rowe said and did, and the way that he played the game. I knew that Alf Ramsey had actually taken everything from Arthur Rowe. That's where it began. And so he took the basics from Arthur Rowe, and then he just built bits onto it himself. And so he thought he would be the natural successor to Arthur Rowe. But at the time, which was in the mid-50s, Spurs had suddenly gone from being the league champions to, finishing near the bottom of the table. There was a big upheaval. The team was getting older. And I think Spurs just thought, well, actually, we don't think that Alf Ramsey will kind of work here. So they kind of left him out of an end of season tour. Then they left him out of the team, and it was just all a bit messy in the end, which is how he managed to go to Ipswich Town.
So what attracted him to Ipswich? Because up until that stage, Ipswich, as far as I'm aware, obviously been around for a decade, but in terms of success, and they had much success. So why was it about them? They thought, actually, I want to go here.
Well, I think it was the best job he could get, to be honest with you, Chris. And I think it was a case of that, he was. I think he realised he was going to have to start again from scratch, and it kind of pretty much was starting from scratch at Ipswich, because they had their kind of training ground was just a kind of mud heap, and his office was a porter cabin, and the phone was on the back wall, and there was one chair in it, and they had a very small squad. They had absolutely no budget whatsoever to be able to buy anything, or to be able to buy in any kind of players of quality. But at least it was fairly close to London, so it was easier for them to get players to go in from London to Ipswich. And I just think he thought it was worth a kind of go, really. But I mean, after their first game, there was I think they put 7,000 or 8,000 people on the average crowd. But Ipswich's performance was so bad that in the next game, the crowd was so low that basically there was barely anybody standing watching them. And so he built them up from there. I mean, from absolutely nothing.
And ironically as well, funny enough, late 70s, that kind of thing happened again with, late 60s, sorry, with Bobby Robson, who then also went on to becoming the manager. So kind of is there. So how long was Alf Ramsey at Ipswich for? How long was he manager?
Well, he was there until 1963. He was there from 55 to 63 when, I mean, he'd actually got the England job in 62, but he carried on as Ipswich manager through until the end of the 62-63 season. And he'd taken them up from, obviously, what today we would consider, what then was considered to be Division 3, and he took them to the Championship, which was an incredible achievement. I mean, to actually do that within 7 years was phenomenal. And I mean, nobody thought that Ipswich would. I mean, that when they were promoted to Division 1, as it then was, everybody thought they would be instantly relegated, because yet again, I mean, he had such a small squad, and I suppose he was quite lucky with the fact that most of his key players were fit throughout the whole 9 months. But everybody expected Tottenham, who had just won the double, to go and win the Championship again. And I mean, people say to me, do you think it's a greater achievement than, say, Brian Clough's in coming out of the second division in 77 and winning the title in 77, 78? And in some ways it is, because at least Brian Clough was able to go and kind of go and buy players like Archie Gemmill, for example, from Derby. He was able to go and hire Peter Shilton. And he was a very significant figure. And he was able to, buy one or two kind of other players. And he had players at the City Ground who were obviously going to be very good, that people hadn't kind of realised that fact before, such as Viv Anderson, Martin O'Neill would be two that I would think, and obviously John Robertson. But Alf Ramsey didn't really have anything. I mean, he did build that kind of club up by himself.
Yeah. So Ipswich in the league, Walter Bottoms left England. You think Alf Ramsey would be the obvious candidate, but it wasn't that easy. It wasn't that easy, was it?
Well, it was remarkable, actually, because the Football Association didn't seem to know who they wanted to be manager. And there were lots of managers, like Bill Nicholson at Spurs, who would have been obvious kind of candidates, but didn't really want to push themselves forward. And I think that one of the reasons was that everybody knew that the kind of pressure of the 1966 World Cup would be on the manager.
Mhm.
I mean, it wasn't a terribly well paid job. I think he got about £6,000 for being the manager of England in '63, and lots and lots of people didn't think that England had a chance of winning the World Cup. So why would they sacrifice a kind of club career to go to England? But you'd have thought that after winning the championship, that Ramsey would be the obvious candidate, and yet the Football Association dithered about for about 2.5 months before it finally realised that he might be the person for them. And I think what amazed me most of all, because I've talked to you obviously about his dislike of the media, that he did actually put himself forward, and I found these interviews with that appeared in the Daily Mail, and it was a series of them over kind of 2 or 3 days. And it was clearly his kind of manifesto for what he would do with England. And he always pretended that he had never campaigned for the England job. Well, that was his campaign speech, to kind of go and get that sort of coverage from the Daily Mail. So he obviously wanted it, and he'd obviously thought about it. And I think, to be honest with you, he sort of looked around and thought, well, although I don't have a great number of players to actually choose from, because in those days, of course, whereas now we have players from across Europe, there were always lots of players from the home counties from the home countries in there. So there were always a lot of Scottish players in teams, or and some Welsh, and of course Irish too. So I think I worked out that by about 1963-64, that his actual squad was only about 89 of kind of players that weren't too old and weren't too young, or basically would have been too old by 66, or wouldn't have been old enough for 66.
So one of the things I gather from the book as well is, in the lead up to 66, it wasn't really till like last year, year or even less than a year, that he seemed to have a settled squad. So results seem to be a little bit mixed in terms of what to do. Well, in terms of where he was going.
We tend to think about the kind of coverage, or those of us of a certain age will remember the way that Graham Taylor was absolutely vilified, and how the Sun used his head as a turnip, and superimposed his head on a turnip, and literally criticised him constantly. I was amazed when I looked at the coverage that Ramsey got in 1965. I think the sort of person he was, and the kind of pressure that he could withstand, was certainly shown there then, because absolutely no one was backing England, or practically no one was backing England, with 12 months to go. And the Football League in those days used to have what they called the Football League Review, which was a little free magazine that went into the football, into every football club's programme. It was just an extra thing for you to kind of read. And despite the fact that there was no love lost between the Football Association and the Football League, the Football League felt as though it had to do a kind of cover to say, will you please stop criticising Ramsey? There is a year to go. And even in that last year, there was some incredible stuff. There was so much criticism of Gordon Banks. People thought that there should be another goalkeeper rather than Gordon Banks. Some people wanted Norman Hunter to play alongside Jack Charlton rather than Bobby Moore. And basically all of the people that we now think of as World Cup heroes, I would say about half of them, most people thought in kind of 1965 that they shouldn't be in the World Cup team. Yeah. And that really did surprise me when I looked at it properly. and I went through all the newspapers.
Yeah, although there were some, not just with results, there were some hiccups with regards to some of the players, choosing them. So, for instance, you had that Sheffield Wednesday betting scandal, and
He
apparently,
did.
like 3 England players, obviously that were, I think it was 3 that were banned for life as a result for that. Weren't they almost guarantees for the squad? In fact, wasn't one of them due to be captain as well?
I don't think that. Well, I'm not sure they would have been, because I think what he was always looking for was a kind of blend. I mean, I don't know anybody. I don't know how many people have seen the Glenn Miller story, the film with James Stewart as he plays Glenn Miller, the kind of band leader. And the whole thing about Glenn Miller was that he was looking for the sound, and he couldn't find the sound until he got 2 instruments perfectly kind of matched. And I always think that's the way that Ramsey thinks about England, that there were players, rather like Jimmy Greaves, that he just couldn't find a place for. They didn't fit into the plan that he got, and so that's why it was. I think in the book I say that Jimmy Greaves was to Ramsey what Pete Best was to the Beatles. That he just didn't kind of fit, and so they had to go for Ringo Starr, and so with Alf it was, well, actually I don't think Jimmy Greaves is going to fit, and I think I want a big centre forward up front. So I know eventually let's take Jeff Hurst, and he had a problem. I mean, certainly in the past 3 weeks, I feel as if I've gone back to 1966, where the newspapers are obviously full of Bobby Charlton, and the Beatles are kind of releasing a new single.
Yeah.
Frankly, all we'd want is a new Cilla Black TV show, and we would be back in 1966. And I think the thing about when I was reading all the kind of tributes to Bobby Charlton, and I was fortunate enough to meet him quite a few times, was that nobody mentioned the fact that there's a piece that Ramsey did after the 1970 World Cup, where he said that he knew Bobby Charlton was going to be in the England team from the moment he took over for the 1960s World Cup. He said, but it wasn't until the May of 1966 that he actually got him to play the way that he wanted him to play.
Yeah.
So it was that close, and it was, the margins were very fine.
Yeah. So I've just mentioned about England captain. Obviously, Bobby Moore is a captain of that side. Young captain as well. I think he was 23, I believe. So why was it the norm to choose captains that young back then? I imagine it wasn't. And also, what was it about Moore that made him think, actually, I'll have him as a captain instead of someone like a Bobby Charlton or even a Jack Charlton?
Well, I can say this, Chris, because I sat down and I watched the World Cup final again, probably another 4 or 5 times. And I've been watching football now for, over 50 years. I have never seen a better individual performance by anybody in a game as Bobby Moore in that 66 final. And it was, for 2 hours, it was absolutely faultless. Some of the things he did. And I mean, I say that he couldn't outrun a chicken. He was that slow. But just his sense of timing, his sense of position, and just the confidence that he exuded, really. And I think that's why he was captain. I mean, obviously, Ramsey did have 1 or 2 kind of problems with him, because Jimmy Greaves and Bobby Moore were kind of great friends, and they liked their social life. And they like to go out late at night and not come back until the early morning and things like that. But I think when it came to it, Ramsey knew that that you needed at least five world-class players to have a chance at winning the World Cup, and obviously Bobby Moore was obviously one of them.
Yeah. So who did you consider the other 4?
Well, he would have had Banks, Ray Wilson at fullback, was really underrated. You know, a very underrated player, and was an absolutely top quality defender. And then, of course, you had Bobby Charlton. Is that 5 or is it 4? I can't count.
4, I think. So it's like one more, I think.
Yeah, who else would it have been then? Who else would it have been? Well, in the end, probably something like Alan Ball, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, he did. I mean, Moore was the best player in that final. Alan Ball was the second best player in that final, which is a strange thing to say about Jeff Hurst, because he scored a hat-trick. And he scored the perfect hat-trick when you look at it, because it's obviously header, right foot, left foot. I mean, you know, very rare, isn't it? I don't, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we get to the actual tournament itself, and England's first game doesn't go well. They've actually draw 0-0 with Uruguay, I believe. Bearing in mind all the criticism they'd had, and also bearing in mind Alf Ramsey's relationship with the media up to that point, what was it, the media criticism like? Was it very ferocious, saying almost like "I told you so"?
Well, it certainly was after the first game. I mean, I think the thing that also amazes me is that before the first game against Uruguay, you could have walked up to Wembley 10 minutes before kickoff and just walked in through the turnstiles. You'd have thought, wouldn't you, that it would have been a complete sellout, and it wasn't. And then England were very disappointing, and they were very disappointing really for the first half hour in the next game against Mexico, until Bobby Charlton got that ball and just ran with it, and then kind of pushed it into the top corner of the net with that fantastic shot. But after that, everything really seemed to kind of change, and bringing in Jeff Hurst alongside Martin Peters in the quarterfinals, so that it was a Hurst-Peters combination there, really did work, because A, they were very great friends, and B, you know, they just trained and kind of practiced together so often at the West Ham training ground, that you thought to yourself, well, yeah, this is a kind of really positive combination here. And so I think that once England had got into the quarterfinals, confidence finally kind of climbed, not only among the kind of players, but also among the media. I mean, that was the kind of story about that particular first sort of fortnight of the tournament, really, that finally people began to say that, you know, Ramsey could win the World Cup. Because one of the remarkable things also was that of all the leading first division managers before the World Cup began, there was only Matt Busby thought that England would win the World Cup.
Yeah, it doesn't still the greatest confidence at all. But obviously the quarterfinal against Argentina was very bad tempered. So yeah, I mean, I think it was like, yeah, their captain was sent off as well. You say the quarterfinal, was that in the media, like I said, the game in which really galvanized the team, not just because they won and they're like a couple of games away from winning a trophy, but also the bad-tempered nature of it, and it almost brought everyone together?
It is, yeah, I think that's right. But also as well, and it's worth remembering this, because the thing is that until '66, people hadn't seen an awful lot of football on TV. And one of the reasons for creating Match of the Day was to get the appetite for, because the BBC thought, oh, here's a kind of program that we might get some kind of ratings for. But their other reason for doing it was that they knew that they'd got to televise the whole of the World Cup live, and actually not many cameramen and not many producers had actually worked on their football. So suddenly they've got 2 or 3 years to get ready for it. So they get Match of the Day on, and then really for the first time, what the '66 World Cup became was a TV event, and it was the first pub event, because pubs were really worried that kind of drinkers wouldn't kind of go out, and so they started to get TVs to go into pubs. Okay. And I mean, that's where it all started, really.
Yeah. So 1-0, they beat Argentina by. They've got Portugal next, and this is a really tough game. Especially got Eusebio, who's been our World Player of the Year, European Cup winner. Would you argue? But obviously, Bobby Charlton scored both goals. Is there an argument to say that that was actually his best performance in an England shirt?
It probably is. I mean, I think it was England's best performance by a mile. I mean, that really should have been the World Cup final. I mean, I sat and watched the whole of that game too, and it was just beautiful to watch. But I have to say that there was the great, there's the great Nobby Stiles quote where Alf Ramsey said, I want you to take out Eusebio, and he said, what for life or just for 90 minutes? and it's funny because somebody did one of the Portuguese TV companies had the kind of bright idea of putting a camera on Bobby Charlton and a camera on Eusebio to see where they were on the pitch. And the Eusebio camera is fascinating because Nobby Stiles is just far enough away from Eusebio in every shot because he knows that he can come close him down. And Eusebio really, in terms of being able to affect the game as much as he had the previous games, I mean, he was a bit stymied. I mean, Nobby Stiles was fantastic. And then similarly, because England were 2-0 up and coasting it, and then Jack Charlton handles the ball. And now, of course, nowadays, he would have been sent off for that, and he would have missed the World Cup final. But in the last minute, after Eusebio scored the penalty, Stiles makes a fantastic tackle, which probably stops an equalising goal. And it's not something. It's kind of not something that many people have seen, I think, because I didn't remember seeing it before. And he literally comes right across him and takes the ball, and he could easily have given away a penalty if he just mistimed it literally by a centimetre. He could have given away a penalty, but he just whips the ball away. And I mean, he had a fantastic World Cup rugby style.
Yeah. So now, obviously, you've got the main game, England, West Germany. It doesn't happen so much now, although this used to happen when I grew up. Was there really this massive jingoistic fervour behind the game? Because obviously it's just, 21 years since the war ended. Was that like that in the media, like this whole jingoistic nature to their coverage of that game?
Yeah, there was. I mean, there were lots of talks about panzer divisions and cutting through the German line and things like that. And I was very interested to go and look back and see what Helmut Schön, the German manager, thought about it. And there was no English translation of his book. So I got hold of someone who could translate it from the German for me. And it was absolutely fascinating because I hadn't realised. I knew he'd been, Schön had been in Dresden during the firebombing, and he had to go and try and find his father. And his father had been, he was lost. They didn't find him for days. And Schön had to drive through the city afterwards, which was piled high with bodies. His father had gone and buried his wedding ring inside a park, which miraculously he managed to find later, just in case that he was able to survive it and go back and reclaim the ring. And Schön himself was a very good footballer, or had been a very good footballer, but he was somewhat criticised in Germany for not going into military service because he was used in a kind of chemist's role. And he was very conscious when he came to England in '66 that the Germans should be very polite to everybody, that they shouldn't talk about the war, they shouldn't try to rub any feelings up the wrong way, because they knew the sort of, or he appreciated the kind of consequences that would bring. But I think he was a bit, it just seems a bit juvenile to us now that people are were kind of writing things in their that way. But I think people have to also appreciate that in '66, and I mean, I can remember this as I was growing up, virtually every Sunday afternoon there was a war film on TV. You'd walk into W.H. Smith's and there would be war comics on the magazine rack. There was The World at War being shown on TV, which was a multi-part documentary narrated by Laurence Olivier. There was a program called All Our Yesterdays, which was incredibly popular, just a half-hour program, and that literally went through the war week by week and lasted for about a dozen years, I think. So people were still very. I mean, the war, as you said, I mean, 21 years ago is kind of not much more than a kind of eye blink in the passage of time. And so it was impossible to take the element of the war out of it.
Yeah. So obviously most people know the story. England win 4-2 after extra time. The second, Mercy's goals controversial. Kenneth Woolsholm's commentary and so on and so forth. I imagine if England won the World Cup now, there'll be massive parades with the trophy and whatnot. But there didn't seem to be anything. Although people are happy, there didn't seem anything like that after the '66 World Cup final. Would that be fair to say? Celebrations are a little bit more sedate.
Well, I mean, you can actually, I mean, if you go back and look at both the Sunday newspapers and the newspapers on a Monday, the coverage of the World Cup final was minuscule compared to the sort of coverage you would get if England won the World Cup. Now there would be special supplements. Newspapers would be sending, a dozen people to a World Cup, and they'd all be writing colour pieces. And basically, there was a match report and there were a few quotes. And on the Sunday, England went to watch the Pathé News film of it on the Sunday morning. On the Sunday afternoon, they had a kind of private, well, kind of private, partly public lunch, and then afterwards, Ramsey had to ask for a private room so he could give them their £1,000 bonus money each, and then they went home. And you hear of Alan Ball and Nobby Stiles having egg and chips, kind of motorway service cafe on the way back. I mean, it's just absolutely bizarre. And I mean, afterwards, now, goodness, I mean, how much would it be worth in sheer bonus money for the people who had kind of won? Afterwards, I mean, there was a lot of money for people like Bobby Charlton, who by 1968 was earning more than Harold Wilson did, was then the Prime Minister. But generally speaking, I mean, I kind of love the sort of understated, typically droll quote from Ray Wilson, who used to say, "The 1966 World Cup, well, it nearly changed my life," because he said he thought that the only thing that he got paid to do was to sign a few kind of autographed footballs, and I think he got about a £5 for that. I mean, obviously, Jeff Hurst was asked to open things, and there were kind of big sort of events in terms of fashion and glamour for people like Bobby Moore. But the thing is that Gordon Banks, who was the met one of the people who was selling souvenirs along what was then Empire Way, later became Wembley Way, and he said that the man selling the souvenirs, T-shirts and rosettes, actually earned more out of the World Cup than he did. Which is a phenomenal. And I hadn't realised this before either. I mean, I went and checked this. I think England's match fee was something like £60. You got £60 for a match fee in those days if you got a cap. And later that year, the Football Association, there was a proposal to raise it to £100 because they won the World Cup, and the whole of the international committee refused, thinking that the players had been paid, they'd been paid well enough. And it was odd. It's just, it seems bizarre to us now, doesn't it? That kind of people would accept that, and it was similarly more in Congress, really, because what happened after '66 was there was such an explosion of interest in football, and suddenly football magazines were appearing everywhere, and football books were appearing everywhere, and yet at least half of the team who had won the World Cup made practically no money out of it at all, including Ramsey.
Bearing in mind, only a few years before, they abolished the minimum wage of footballers. Didn't some of the players think, hang on a minute here, we deserve more than this? Especially as FA officials themselves seem to be getting paid quite a bit from not just individually, but from themselves, from not the coffers, like increasing as a result of what happened.
Well, certainly from expenses and hospitality. I think that's one thing that we haven't talked about, but when they abolished the maximum wage, I think that was another great thing for England, because finally there was a bit of financial independence for players, even though it wasn't a great deal of money. I think Jimmy Greaves got £60 a week. Someone else got £80 a week, and things like that. So, but at least relatively speaking, they were now able to buy their own cars. They weren't having to use public transport. They were now able to move into a better house. There's a great piece of film in which was actually filmed in the year that the maximum wage was abolished, and it's centered on West Bromwich Albion. I think you can find it on YouTube, and you see the kind of lifestyle of the 1963 player, where, he's living in a terraced house. They've got the flying sort of ducks on the wall, and he helps out in the kitchen, and West Brom are sort of training in some, oh goodness, it's a dreadful, dreadful pitch. And then they're coming back and they're having their shower, and there aren't any towels, so they're having to stand on newspapers to get dry. It's just a bizarre, let's face it, it was only 60 years ago.
Yeah, it seems very bizarre. You'd think after winning that tournament of that magnitude, that team would go on to better and better things, or at least stay at the top level, which England did for a short while, but there were certain signs that actually all was not going to go well. For instance, the 68 European Championships, where they lost to Yugoslavia, and Murray got sent off. So there seemed to be, even before 1970, there seemed to be little events which were cropping up that made me think, oh, maybe things aren't well, or maybe things might go against England in Mexico in 1970.
Well, the ironic thing is that England took a better side. They had a better team, I think. When Alf Ramsey made his ultimate England choice after he'd retired, and he picked I think he put in he took out Nubby Styles, and he put in Alan Mullery, and then he replaced Roger Hunt, who had he retired shortly after the World Cup, and put in Francis Lee. So basically, with kind of Mullery and Lee and the '66 World Cup team, that was his team of sort of teams. But I think, generally speaking, that they were certainly a fitter side, I think, in 1970. Terry Cooper was a very good attacking fullback, for example, and Mullery was a very good player. Lee was a very good player, and it just strengthened the side in certain areas. And of course, some of the players, such as Alan Ball, were kind of older and sort of wiser by 1972, and Ball had just won the league championship with Everton. So, had they not lost to West Germany in such bizarre circumstances, would they have gone on and won in '70? I still quite don't think so, Chris, because that Brazilian side was just so brilliant. You just saw. Frankly, they could have. Well, they almost did play without a goalkeeper, because they didn't let in many goals. But I've seen them all, and kind of Felix really should have saved them. But or at least have saved 3 or 4 of them. And but I mean, they didn't really need a goalkeeper because you couldn't get the ball off them.
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting. I mean, obviously, England and Brazil was probably the best game of that tournament. Possibly not in terms of drama as such, because you had like Italy versus West Germany semi-final, but just in terms of technical and tactical ability. I mean, that game, the highlights I've seen, was just a brilliant game to observe.
I do remember watching it live, and it was just a wonderful spectacle.
Yeah.
And again, that's the thing that people will kind of notice if they watch any of the games from that particular period. And this is what I noticed, from obviously 1966, because we're so used now to players having their shirts covered in sponsorship, wearing, coloured sort of boots, falling down when they're, or kind of writhing about as if they've just been hit by Mike Tyson in his kind of prime. And there was none of that. And there's kind of none of, oh goodness, there's only 2 minutes left, let's sort of drag the ball to the corner flag. Absolutely, it was just a wonderful game. And obviously, I mean, it was a fantastic goal. Everybody remembers Gordon Banks's fantastic save and Bobby Moore's fantastic tackle.
Yeah.
3 great highlights from that game.
Obviously, England have lost to West Germany in bizarre circumstances. What gave Ramsey the appetite to continue after that? Because he must have thought, okay, well, I've won the World Cup, I've lost it. Why did he think actually he might carry on as England manager? What was his reasoning behind it?
Well, I think it was to be honest with you, I just think it was the pride of the defeated man. Because he could have gone to Manchester United. Busby wanted to take him to Manchester United as manager. I don't think Alf was really a man of the North. I don't think he would have. I don't know how he would have, prospered in kind of northern soil really. But I think most of all that the reason he didn't want to go was that he felt he should carry on and try and win the World Cup again. Whereas I think he would have been better leaving to go to Manchester United.
Yeah. Was Poland, because obviously they've got qualifying for the 1974 World Cup and they're taking on a Polish side, were they underestimated?
Yeah, well, I think also the fact is that England really didn't play very well in the first game against Poland. And I mean, that's really what caused the kind of pressure for the second game against them. And also, I think that, the side had actually changed by then. So you had got Norman Hunter in the side. I mean, obviously Peter Shilton was in goal, but he was still a very young goalkeeper.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think it kind of, I talked before about, the sound and the blend. And I don't think Ramsey had kind of found that, because he always had this suspicion, the way that he did about Jimmy Greaves, about players of kind of flair. So, the likes of Tony Curry, Frank Worthington, they weren't kind of welcomed in really. Rodney Marsh, and he didn't really know how to sort of reconcile their kind of presence with the sort of squad that he kind of got. And so I don't think we found the perfect team really.
After that happened, obviously in the manner it happened, he was sacked, or the second took a long time to occur, although everyone knew he was going to get the sack. Do you think him staying on actually damaged his chances of getting actual a decent club side? I know he managed Birmingham City for a while, but do you think it really damaged his managerial standing, although he'd won the World Cup 7 years earlier?
I think the problem was that by the time he left Ipswich, and of course it was, the kind of maximum wage was beginning to really kind of kick in then, the club management had changed so much. And he was much older. When he was at Ipswich, he was able to go onto the training pitch because he was kind of young enough to sort of do that. And he'd always been a tracksuit manager at England. I mean, he didn't stand on in a suit. But when he went to Birmingham, he just felt he was a bit old for a kind of tracksuit. And so he would be on the side of the pitch in his suit, looking like someone who was the sort of manager of a small town bank as opposed to a football manager. And of course, in those days, agents were beginning to come into football. And he had a lot of problems because Birmingham had one great asset who was Trevor Francis. And, you know, the board really wanted to sell Francis and make some money. He didn't want to sell, but you always knew that Birmingham were going to sell, and they almost sold for a year before Trevor went to Forest. I remember, you know, I spent a week in the Nottingham Forest car park waiting for him to sign. Yeah. It was, you know, for £1 million, which then was a phenomenal amount of money. But I think it showed the kind of difference in the game, or the way it had just suddenly been transformed, really.
Just quickly, because I know we're coming to the end, why did it take so long for England's players to be recognised a lot by the FA? Because, like I said, at the time, they weren't getting a lot of rewards, but it seemed to take them a while to actually gain something, be it MBEs or even the status that they should have got back then. I mean, sadly, someone like Bobby Moore obviously died relatively young, so he didn't get the status. But why did it take that long for everyone to like be recognised with like the way it should have been?
I think it's just been a social and cultural change. I mean, if you look in '66 when Alf Ramsey got his knighthood, and you look at the other people who got knighthoods in that year, there was the chairman of the Scottish Rail Authority, or the head of the White Fish Commission. I mean, and those were the kind of people who kind of got awards then. I mean, everybody thinks that, oh yeah, that as soon as Harold Wilson gave the Beatles gongs in about 66 or 65 or something like that, that, you know, that's when the celebrity sparkle about the awards began. But I mean, it really wasn't, not fully until the kind of 1990s, I think, really. And so if you were a kind of showbiz star, or you were a sportsman, or even if you were a kind of cultural figure like an artist, you know, you were very much at the back of the queue. It was kind of basically, you know, heads of kind of industrial firms and leading civil servants.
I mean, it's a fascinating book, as I say. The detailing is immense. Bearing in mind as well, I'll show it to everyone again. Please recommend to buy this. Bearing in mind, this is something which, again, which everyone seems to know about. I mean, the depth in here is excellent. Just quickly, with regards to not just this book, but your other sides of work, where can people go and view your work?
Well, they're all still in print, remarkably, Chris, which is quite some feat. And everybody will talk about Provided You Don't Kiss Me, because that was the first one, and I mean that continues to sell nowadays. I mean, I very rarely go into a bookshop and find there's none of my books in there or there, and I kind of always have to go and kind of check, because sports literature these days finds it really difficult to compete in bookshops, really, because the sports sections aren't terribly big. But I'm, you know, I'm really fortunate that, touch wood, so far I'm kind of represented. I mean, I'll be interested. I mean, you know, thank you very much for your praise of the book, and I'm pleased that I wrote it now, because I think there might have been a kind of you know, rush of books in, say, 26 to mark the 60th anniversary. But, you know, I'm pretty pleased with the way that I've covered it. In fact, it's probably one of the most satisfying books I've ever written, I think. And it's been the best reviewed, which is a remarkable thing. I've never had a set of reviews for a book as good as this, even for Provided You Don't Kiss Me.
Well, the reviews are deserved. Again, thank you so much for doing this interview. I know you're a busy person, so it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Pleasure, Chris.
Thank you very much for coming on the podcast.